Under the golden sunrise of a crisp spring morning, Ethan Carter climbed onto his old John Deere tractor, just as his father and grandfather had done before him. For over 4 generations, the Carter family had worked this 2,000-acre farm, supplying fresh produce to the entire county. As Ethan planted the first rows of corn and wheat, his phone buzzed relentlessly. He ignored it. The land came first, always had, always would. By noon, as he sat under the oak tree behind his farmhouse, he finally checked his messages. 10 missed calls, 3 voicemails, a formal email from the Chestnut Grove Homeowners Association, HOA. The subject line made his stomach drop. Violation notice, immediate action required. The letter accused him of disturbing their community with his tractor noise and offensive farm odors. Even worse, it demanded he cease all farming operations within 500 feet of the new housing development, or face a $200 daily fine. Ethan crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. This farm had stood since 1895, long before those overpriced houses popped up. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. The HOA had far bigger plans that involved stealing his land. The next morning, as Ethan stepped onto his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, the sound of a car door slamming made him look up. A woman in a crisp white pantsuit marched across his gravel driveway, flanked by 2 men in polo shirts with Chestnut Grove HOA embroidered on their chests. "Mr. Carter," she called out, a forced smile plastered on her face. "I'm Vivian Brooks, president of the Chestnut Grove HOA. We need to discuss your repeated violations." Ethan crossed his arms. "There's nothing to discuss. You have no authority over my farm." Vivian's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Actually, according to the county zoning board, your agricultural exemption expired last year. That means your land is now subject to our community standards." Ethan's pulse quickened. His property tax bills hadn't changed. His family had farmed this land for over a century. No way could an HOA just claim jurisdiction. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "And even if my exemption did expire, I never received any notice." Vivian pulled a document from her clipboard and handed it to him. "This is a formal cease and desist order. You have 48 hours to stop farming near our property line, or you'll be fined daily." Ethan let out a dry laugh and tore the paper in half. Good luck enforcing that. The shocking discovery. Later that afternoon, his cousin Luke called in a panic. "Ethan, something's not right. I heard from a buddy on the town council. Vivian's been having private meetings with developers. They're up to something." A bad feeling settled in Ethan's gut. That night, he pored over county records online. His agricultural exemption was still valid for 5 more years. Vivian had lied. For the next week, HOA letters and noise complaints poured in. The sheriff, an old high school friend, apologized but said he was required to respond. Then came the final blow. One afternoon, as Ethan worked his eastern fields, he spotted men in suits with tablets surveying the land. He drove his truck across the field, dust kicking up behind him. "Can I help you?" he asked, stepping out. One of the men, James Weston, extended a hand. "Westwood Development Corporation. Just doing preliminary planning." "Planning for what?" Ethan's voice was steady, but his stomach churned. Weston glanced at his tablet. "According to our documents, Chestnut Grove HOA sold 1,700 acres to us 3 weeks ago. Construction begins next month." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. "I never sold my land." Weston turned his screen toward Ethan. Official county documents. Stamped, signed, approved. The owner listed. Chestnut Grove Community Trust. The HOA had stolen his land. Ethan raced home and tore open his safe. His property deeds were still inside, unchanged, but when he called the county recorder's office, the clerk's response made his blood run cold. According to our records, 1,700 acres were transferred to the Chestnut Grove HOA 6 weeks ago. You now only own 300 acres. His hands trembled as he opened the email attachment the clerk sent him. There it was, a forged signature. His name on a contract he had never signed. Outside his window, Vivian sat in her luxury SUV, talking on her phone, staring right at him. When their eyes met, she smirked and waved. Ethan clenched his fists. He had less than a month before the bulldozers arrived. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing. The HOA had stolen his land. He needed proof. He needed a way to stop them. But first, he needed to understand how they had pulled this off. He called his lawyer, Sam Grayson, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney. When Ethan explained the situation, Sam swore under his breath. This is the most blatant land grab I've seen in 30 years, but they covered their tracks well. Sam reviewed the forged documents and frowned. According to this, your grandfather sold development rights decades ago, and now the HOA is exercising them. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's a lie. My grandfather would never sell off our family's legacy. Proving that in court will take time, Sam warned. But we don't have time. Ethan slammed his fist against the table. Then I need to hit them where it hurts. Fast. The forgotten weapon. Late that night, unable to sleep, Ethan dug through his family's old records. Birth certificates, property deeds, tax forms. He searched for anything that might help. And then, he found it. An aged, yellowed document from 1923. The original water rights agreement. His great-grandfather had allowed the county to build a reservoir on their land. One that now supplied water to the entire area, including Chestnut Grove. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the fine print. Agricultural use takes priority over all other water allocations. Water rights are tied to the original homestead, the 300 acres he still legally owned. He grinned. The HOA might have stolen his land, but they had overlooked one crucial fact. He controlled their water supply. The first strike. At sunrise, Ethan met with James Patterson, a retired county engineer who had maintained the water system for 40 years. James spread out old blueprints on his kitchen table. Your granddad was smart, he said, pointing to a junction on the map. The main control valve is still on your property. Always has been. Ethan snapped photos. And legally, I can redirect the water? James chuckled. Not only can you, but based on this agreement, you're required to ensure your farm has priority access. That afternoon, Ethan filed the necessary paperwork with the State Water Authority. Within 48 hours, the first complaints rolled in. Chestnut Grove runs dry. Ethan sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, as his phone exploded with calls. Residents of Chestnut Grove were waking up to low water pressure, then no water at all. Vivian Brooks called 17 times before he finally answered. What did you do? She shrieked. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee. Nothing illegal. People have children, elderly parents. You can't just cut off their water. Ethan smirked. People need food too, Vivian. But you stole the land that grows it. The next morning, Chestnut Grove was in chaos. Homeowners stormed the HOA office demanding answers. No water for showers, no water to cook, no water to drink. The community Facebook page was flooded with complaints. Vivian called an emergency HOA meeting that night, but the residents weren't there to listen. They were there to demand her resignation. Ethan's plan was working. He wasn't the villain the HOA had painted him to be. The real villains were the ones who stole his land and got caught. The HOA cracks under pressure. Later that evening, as Ethan checked his irrigation system, 3 police cars pulled up his driveway. Sheriff Ben Miller, an old high school friend, stepped out, looking uncomfortable. "Got complaints about water tampering," he said, rubbing his neck. Ethan handed him the original water rights document. "I'm within my legal rights, Ben. My land, my water." Ben skimmed the papers and let out a long sigh. "Damn, Ethan. You're right." He turned to his officers. "We're done here." As the police left, a news van rolled in. A young reporter, Julie Ramirez, jumped out, microphone in hand. "Mr. Carter, can you explain what's happening with the water supply?" Ethan smiled. "I'd be happy to. But first, let's talk about how the Chestnut Grove HOA illegally stole my family's farm." The camera zoomed in on the fake sale documents as Ethan held them up. The next morning, the entire town was talking. The developers panic by noon. Westwood Development Corporation had pulled out of the deal. The CEO issued a public statement claiming they had no idea the land was stolen. Ethan's phone rang. It was Vivian. Her voice was shaky, desperate. "Maybe we can negotiate compensation." Ethan leaned against his truck, watching Chestnut Grove residents line up for bottled water. "The time for talking was before you falsified documents," he said coldly. "Now I just want my land back." Vivian hesitated. Then, in a whisper, she admitted, "The developers might be willing to reconsider if there's a water issue." Ethan smiled. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., my kitchen table. Bring the developers, your lawyer, and those fake documents you used to steal my land." A community awakens. That night, lights were on in every house in Chestnut Grove. Nobody was sleeping. For the first time, they wondered, where had their water really come from? At 9 a.m. sharp, Ethan sat at his kitchen table as Vivian Brooks, her lawyer, and a representative from Westwood Development Corp. arrived. The once confident HOA president looked exhausted, her designer blazer slightly wrinkled. The developer, Michael Davis, a sharp-looking man in his 40s, spoke first. "Mr. Carter, we were misled by the HOA. We purchased that land in good faith. Had we known—" Ethan held up a hand. "Let's cut the nonsense. You want water? I want my land back?" Vivian's lawyer cleared his throat. "The land sale is legally binding, Mr. Carter." Ethan smirked and slid 2 documents across the table. One, a formal request for an injunction, already filed with the county. 2, his water rights agreement, which explicitly stated that agriculture takes priority over all water use. Michael skimmed the papers, his jaw tightening. "If we can't guarantee water, our investors will walk." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Then give me my land back." Vivian's eyes flashed with panic. "That's impossible. The contracts are signed." Michael cut her off. "We're not sinking millions into a project that can't even flush toilets." He turned to Ethan. "We'll negotiate." Vivian turned pale. The HOA's downfall. By noon, news broke that Westwood Development had withdrawn from the project. Vivian called an emergency HOA meeting, but this time she wasn't in charge. Tom Baker, Ethan's neighbor who had secretly warned him, stood up. "I make a motion to remove Vivian Brooks as HOA president." The vote? Unanimous. Vivian stormed out, her perfect life crumbling. Justice is served a week later. The county court ruled in Ethan's favor. The fraudulent land sale was overturned. The judge ordered a full investigation into the HOA's financial records. 2 months later, the district attorney filed criminal charges against Vivian and several HOA board members for fraud and bribery. Vivian lost everything. Her husband divorced her. Her bank accounts were frozen. But Ethan, he got his land back, a new beginning. After the dust settled, Ethan received an unexpected visit from Michael Davis. "We still want to build something here," Michael admitted, "but not luxury homes, something better." Instead of strip malls, Westwood proposed a modern farming education center. It would create jobs for locals, process crops from small farmers in the area, teach city kids where their food comes from. Ethan considered it, then shook Michael's hand. "If it benefits the community, I'm in." From division to unity. Within months, the HOA was restructured. Farmers and homeowners worked together instead of against each other. Chestnut Grove residents apologized to Ethan, realizing they had been blindly following corrupt leadership. 1 year later, Ethan stood in his field, watching his son teach a suburban kid how to drive a tractor. He smiled. This land didn't just grow crops, it grew a community. Ethan stood on his restored farmland, the golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon. A year ago, he had nearly lost everything. Now, his farm wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. He watched as his son, Jake, guided a teenager from Chestnut Grove through the basics of driving a tractor. The same people who once viewed his farm as an inconvenience were now eager to learn. A year ago, they wanted to bulldoze this land, Ethan thought. Now their kids are helping plant next season's crops. The final blow to the HOA Vivian Brooks wasn't done fighting. She had lost the HOA presidency, but she still had connections. One afternoon, as Ethan loaded crates of produce for the new community farmers market, a familiar black SUV pulled up. Vivian stepped out, her once polished appearance now fraying at the edges. "You won, Carter," she admitted, bitterness lacing her voice. "But don't think for a second that this is over." Ethan leaned against his truck, arms crossed. "Vivian, you're out of power. You have no land, no HOA backing you. What exactly do you think you can do?" Vivian's smirk faltered. For the first time, she had no answer. That night, Ethan's lawyer, Sam, called. "Big news. The county investigation uncovered more fraud than we thought. Vivian and her board members took kickbacks from developers for years." Within a month, the district attorney filed additional charges. Vivian's assets were seized, and she was forced to sell her mansion to cover legal fees. The woman who had once bragged about turning farmland into million-dollar estates now lived in a small rental home on the outskirts of town. Ethan didn't celebrate her downfall. He had bigger things to focus on. The new chapter. The modern farming center was already under construction. Local farmers could now process their crops without relying on corporations that underpaid them. Even better? The Chestnut Grove HOA bylaws were rewritten to permanently protect agricultural land. No more noise complaints. No more interference. At the next HOA meeting, Ethan attended as a guest. Tom Baker, the new president, stood up. "Before we close, I'd like to make a motion." He turned to Ethan. "How about we make the farmers market a permanent event?" The crowd cheered. Ethan nodded in approval. The best revenge. One evening, as Ethan sat on his porch, he saw Vivian drive past his farm. She slowed down, staring at the land she had nearly stolen. Ethan smiled to himself. She had lost everything. Meanwhile, his farm was flourishing. The community was stronger than ever. That was the best revenge of all. A year had passed since Ethan Carter stood in court, fighting for his family's legacy. Now, as he walked through his flourishing fields, he reflected on how everything had changed. The land was his again. The HOA was reformed, and the community that once saw his farm as a nuisance now depended on it. That morning, Ethan stood at the entrance of the Chestnut Grove Farmers Market, watching families pick out fresh produce. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, look! That's the farmer who grows our food." Ethan chuckled as the mother gave him a grateful smile. A year ago, these same people had signed petitions against him. Now, they were supporting his farm. The final nail in Vivian's coffin. The last piece of justice came when Vivian Brooks was officially convicted of fraud. News cameras captured her leaving the courthouse, her once pristine appearance replaced with exhaustion and defeat. Ethan didn't waste time thinking about her. He had bigger things to focus on. A legacy secured. As the sun set over his land, Ethan sat with his wife and son on the farmhouse porch. "You ever think about what would have happened if we lost?" Jake asked. Ethan smiled, looking at the fields. "Sometimes. But then I remember something important." "What's that?" Jake asked. Ethan watched as families from Chestnut Grove and local farmers laughed together, enjoying food grown from the very soil that had once been under threat. People forget that fancy houses and perfect lawns don't feed anyone. He gestured toward the fields. This land isn't just dirt. It's a legacy, a community, and now it's stronger than ever. As the wind rustled through the wheat, Ethan knew one thing for certain. The HOA had tried to destroy his farm, but instead, they had made it untouchable. Ethan Carter's battle wasn't just about farmland. It was about fighting back against corruption, standing up for what's right, and protecting a legacy. The HOA and developers thought they could bully a farmer into submission, but they underestimated the power of perseverance, community, and knowing your rights. In the end, Ethan's determination and knowledge turned the tables. What started as an attempt to steal his land ended with the HOA's downfall, a corrupt leader exposed, and a stronger community than ever before. His story proves that. Checkmark justice prevails when you refuse to back down. Knowledge is power. Ethan won because he knew his rights. A strong community is unstoppable. People who once opposed him became his greatest allies. At first, Ethan was just fighting for his land, but by the end, he had created something even greater, a future where no one could take advantage of small farmers again. This story is fictional, but land disputes like this happen all the time. Homeowners associations, big corporations, and corrupt officials often abuse their power to push people out. If you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to take what's yours, know your rights. Laws and contracts are powerful. Use them to your advantage. Document everything. Keep records of all agreements, deeds, and communications. Get the community on your side. When people unite, they can overcome even the biggest threats. Ethan Carter's story is a reminder to fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Because at the end of the day, justice belongs to those who refuse to give up.